What secret does the doctor hide when his treatments become doorways to a dead past? And where does the mind truly end and horror begin? Welcome to Classic Storytime Hub, where we present A Tale of the Ragged Mountains by Edgar Allan Poe, retold in English in a haunting narrative that blurs the line between memory, identity, and madness.
I first encountered Augustus Bedloe in the autumn of 1827 while living on the outskirts of Charlottesville, Virginia. Our meeting was unremarkable, almost accidental, but the man himself was anything but. From the very beginning, he unsettled me, not through rudeness or eccentric behavior, but through something far more difficult to name. There was no clear way to place him in the world. I tried to understand him, his temperament, his habits, even his physical presence, but every attempt ended in contradiction. When I asked about his family, the answers dissolved into vagueness. When I pressed about his past, the trail went cold. Where he came from was a mystery he either could not or would not clarify. Even his age refused to settle. He spoke often of being young, insisted on it, even smiled faintly when doing so. And yet there were moments, quiet moments, when his expression fell slack and distant, when he seemed impossibly old. Not merely aged, but ancient, as if time had passed through him rather than over him. In those moments, I could almost believe he had lived a century or more. His appearance only deepened the unease. Bedloe was unusually tall, but so thin it appeared his body had been stretched rather than grown. His posture sagged forward, as though the weight of invisible years bent his spine. His arms and legs were long and sharply narrow, stripped of any suggestion of strength. His skin carried no warmth of color, no blood, no vitality, just a pale stillness like parchment kept too long from the sun. His face was unforgettable. A broad, low forehead, a mouth too large, too flexible, capable of expressions that never quite changed. His teeth, intact, healthy, were arranged in a wild unevenness that drew the eye despite oneself. And when he smiled, it was not grotesque nor threatening, but deeply sorrowful. The smile never shifted, never brightened. It carried the same quiet despair every time, as though it had been carved there long ago and forgotten by its maker. But it was his eyes that lingered with me. They were large, unnaturally so, and perfectly round, like those of a watchful animal. In shifting light, their pupils reacted with startling speed, tightening and widening with the same sharp precision seen in a cat poised to strike or flee. At times, when the light dimmed and those pupils expanded, I had the disturbing sense that he was seeing far more than the room allowed. Standing before him, one could not escape the feeling that Augustus Bedloe did not merely observe the world, but waited for it to remember him. In moments of heightened emotion, his eyes transformed. What had once seemed dull and lifeless suddenly ignited, so intensely that it was difficult to meet his gaze. They did not merely reflect light, they generated it. A cold, unnatural brightness flared within them, as though something inside his skull had been briefly lit, like a flame behind glass. The effect was startling, almost supernatural. And yet outside those rare surges of excitement, the opposite was true. Most of the time, his eyes appeared empty, clouded, covered by a thin, lifeless film that dulled their depth and drained them of expression. In those moments, they resembled the eyes of something long buried, preserved perhaps, but unmistakably dead. The contrast was so extreme, it left one uncertain which version of him was real. These traits clearly troubled him. He spoke often of them, not directly, but in a strange, uneasy way. His remarks hovered between explanation and apology, as though he felt compelled to justify his own existence. When I first heard him speak this way, it unsettled me deeply. There was something humiliating in his tone, something quietly desperate. Over time, however, repetition dulled my reaction, and the discomfort faded into familiarity. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Without ever stating it outright, Bedloe suggested that his current condition was not his natural state. He implied, carefully, almost defensively, that he had once been physically striking, that his body had not always carried this look of depletion and decay. A prolonged history of neural pain, he claimed, had worn him down piece by piece, stripping away not only his strength, but whatever vitality that once defined him. For years, he said, he had lived under constant medical supervision.
A week later, the newspapers of Charlottesville reported with solemnity, "We have the painful duty of announcing the death of Mr. Augustus Bedloe, a gentleman whose amiable manners and many virtues have long endeared him to the citizens of Charlottesville. Mr. Bedloe, for several years, had suffered from neuralgia, a condition which occasionally threatened his life. Yet this alone cannot account for the extraordinary circumstances of his passing. The immediate cause of his death was one of exceptional singularity." And so it was that Bedloe's journey, through the ragged mountains, through the Indian city, through death itself, ended. A life ordinary in appearance, yet entwined with events that no man could imagine. The lines between consciousness, memory, and the miraculous had blurred entirely, leaving behind a tale that defied reason and lingered like a shadow in the mind. A few days after his excursion to the ragged mountains, Bedloe fell ill. A slight chill had developed into fever, accompanied by a dangerous rush of blood to the head. To alleviate this, Dr. Templeton resorted to topical bleeding. Leeches were applied to his temples, a common, trusted remedy. But fate, it seemed, had a cruel twist in store. Among the medicinal leeches, one foreign creature had slipped in unnoticed, a venomous, writhing leech, the kind occasionally found in nearby ponds. It latched on to a small artery in Bedloe's right temple. Its resemblance to the harmless leeches was close enough to deceive even a careful hand, and the mistake went unnoticed until it was far too late. Within a terrifyingly brief span, Bedloe was gone, dead. A note in the local paper warned, "The poisonous Sung Soo of Charlottesville may always be distinguished from the medicinal leech by its black color and its writhing, serpentine movements, which nearly resemble those of a snake." I happened to be speaking with the editor of the newspaper about this extraordinary accident when a curious thought struck me. I asked why the deceased's name had been printed as Bedloe without the final E. "I presume," I said, "that you have authority for this spelling. I have always understood the name to be Bedloe with an E." "Authority? No," he replied. "It's a simple typographical error. The name is Bedloe everywhere. I've never seen it spelled otherwise." I turned away, muttering under my breath, struck by the staggering irony. "Then it is true," I said, my voice low, trembling, "that reality is stranger than any fiction. Bedloe, without the E, is no longer Bedloe at all, but Oldeb, conversing once more with the living. And yet the world calls it a mere typographical mistake." A shiver ran down my spine. In that instant, the boundaries between life and death, past and present, fiction and truth, dissolved completely. The tale of Bedloe, of the ragged mountains, of the Indian city, and the fatal arrow of destiny remained a mystery that would haunt the mind long after the body had returned to dust. The physician responsible was Dr. Templeton, an elderly man, perhaps nearing 70, whom Bedloe had first met years earlier in Saratoga. During that visit, under the doctor's care, Bedloe experienced a relief so significant that he never fully decided whether it had been genuine or imagined. Either way, the impression was lasting. So lasting, in fact, that Bedloe, possessed of considerable wealth, made a decisive choice. He entered into a private arrangement with Dr. Templeton, a generous yearly payment in exchange for exclusive care. From that point on, the doctor devoted his time, his attention, and his full medical judgment to Bedloe alone. No other patients, no divided loyalty. Just one fragile body, just one mind in steady decline, and a physician who never left his side. In his earlier years, Dr. Templeton had been a man of motion rather than routine. He traveled extensively, and during a long stay in Paris, he encountered ideas that would shape the rest of his life. It was there that he fell, gradually, fervently, under the influence of Mesmer's theories, embracing the belief that the human body could be governed by unseen forces, guided not by medicine alone, but by will. Templeton did not merely study these doctrines, he believed them. When conventional treatments failed to ease Bedloe's suffering, the doctor turned entirely to what he called magnetic remedies. To the surprise of all involved, perhaps even himself, the results were undeniable. The sharp, relentless pains that tormented his patient softened. Episodes that once left Bedloe incapacitated became shorter, less severe. Relief followed where nothing else had worked. Naturally, Bedloe's faith followed. If the treatment brought comfort, then surely the theory behind it deserved trust. Encouraged by this success, Templeton pushed further. Like many men consumed by an idea, he was no longer satisfied with partial belief. He wanted conviction. He pressed his patient, not forcefully, but persistently, to surrender fully to the process. Eventually, Bedloe agreed to undergo a series of experiments. What followed was something rarely witnessed in America at that time. Through repetition, slow, methodical, and relentless, a subtle connection began to form between the two men. Not all at once, but steadily. A rapport, as Templeton called it, a magnetic bond, one mind learning to respond instinctively to the influence of another. I should clarify that I cannot say this connection extended beyond the ability to induce sleep. There were no dramatic displays, no public marvels. But that single effect, sleep itself, grew alarmingly powerful. At first, Templeton failed completely. The early attempts ended in frustration. Bedloe remained awake, restless, resistant. Even by the 5th or 6th trial, the results were weak and unreliable, achieved only after prolonged effort. It was not until the 12th session that the barrier finally gave way. That night marked a turning point. From then on, Bedloe's resistance collapsed with startling speed. His will seemed to loosen its grip, yielding more readily each time. When I eventually came to know them, the process no longer required gestures, words, or preparation. Sleep arrived instantly, summoned by the doctor's intention alone. On more than one occasion, it happened without warning. Bedloe would sink into deep, unnatural slumber at the mere presence of Templeton, sometimes without even knowing the doctor was in the room. It was as though his mind had learned a new law of gravity, and Dr. Templeton had become its center.
I hesitate even now to put these events into words. Only in the present year, 1845, when such phenomena are discussed openly and demonstrated before crowds, do I feel justified in recording what once seemed utterly impossible. At the time, the truth of it carried the weight of madness. Bedloe's temperament was volatile by nature. He was intensely sensitive to sound, to temperature, to emotion itself. His moods ignited quickly and burned fiercely, fed by an imagination that was not merely active, but dangerously inventive. That imagination, I believe, was further sharpened by his reliance on morphine. He consumed it in astonishing quantities, so much so that life without it was unthinkable to him. Each morning followed the same ritual. He drank a cup of powerful, bitter coffee. He ate nothing. Then came the morphine, a heavy dose, swallowed without hesitation. Only after this preparation did he leave the house, setting out on foot, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by a single dog, disappearing for hours into the bleak hills stretching west and south of Charlottesville, the barren, wind-scoured ridges known as the Ragged Mountains. These excursions were long, solitary, and unsettling. On one such day, late in November, the air hung thick and warm, the landscape wrapped in a hazy stillness. It was that peculiar pause between seasons Americans call Indian summer, when autumn seems to forget itself and time slows without explanation. As usual, Bedloe set off toward the hills, and did not return. The daylight faded, evening deepened. Hour after hour passed with no sign of him. By 8 o'clock, our concern had hardened into fear. We were preparing to search the mountains ourselves when, without warning, he appeared at the door. He looked, well, no weaker than usual. In fact, there was an unusual brightness about him, a restless energy, almost exhilaration. He greeted us calmly, dismissed our worry, and spoke as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. But the story he then began to tell, the account of where he had gone and what had kept him so long, was unlike anything I had ever heard. "You'll remember," he said, "that I left Charlottesville shortly after 9 that morning. I headed straight toward the mountains, following instinct more than intention. By 10, I found myself entering a narrow gorge I had never seen before, one that seemed to open only for me. I followed its twisting course with growing fascination. The landscape on either side was not grand in the usual sense, no towering peaks, no dramatic cliffs, but it possessed something far more intoxicating, a quiet desolation, a beauty so bleak and untouched it felt deliberate, almost sacred. The silence was absolute. The ground beneath my boots, gray moss, gray stone, gave me the unsettling conviction that no human foot had ever pressed there before. The place felt unopened. The entrance to the ravine was so well hidden, so awkwardly placed among the folds of the land, that it could only be reached by chance. And as I moved deeper, I began to believe, truly believe, that I was the first, the only one, the sole living person who had ever stepped into that forgotten corridor of the mountains. The mist made everything worse, or better. I still can't decide. That peculiar Indian summer haze hung thick and low, more like smoke than fog, softening every shape and deepening every impression it touched. At no point could I see more than a few yards ahead, perhaps 10 at most. The path twisted constantly, folding back on itself, and with the sun completely erased from the sky, I quickly lost any sense of direction.
North, south, east, it all dissolved. and by then, the morphine had begun to speak. As it always did, it sharpened the world instead of dulling it. Every detail grew impossibly vivid, saturated with meaning. A trembling leaf became an event. The color of a single blade of grass felt intentional. The shape of a clover suggested hidden patterns. The low hum of a bee carried a rhythm I felt rather than heard. Even the flash of a dewdrop, the breath of the wind, the faint perfume rising from the forest floor, all of it combined into something overwhelming. It was as if the ordinary world had cracked open. From every sound, every movement, every scent, a flood of ideas surged forth, fragmented, brilliant, disorderly. Thoughts collided and scattered, forming a restless procession of images and emotions. There was no structure to them, no logic I could grasp, only a rushing sense that I was walking through a place where meaning itself had been loosened. And the deeper I went, the more the mountains seemed to listen. I remained lost in that restless state for hours, he continued, moving forward more by habit than by direction. As time passed, the mist thickened until it became a wall. I could no longer see the path, I had to feel for it. Every step turned cautious, my feet probing the ground before trusting it with my weight. That was when the unease took hold. It wasn't fear, exactly, not at first. It was a trembling uncertainty, a nervous pause that crept into my muscles and refused to leave. I hesitated with every step, terrified that the ground might suddenly vanish beneath me, that I would plunge into some unseen ravine. The mountains felt hollow then, full of hidden mouths waiting to open. Old stories came back to me, tales I had once dismissed, whispered rumors about the ragged hills, about savage, nameless tribes said to dwell in their forests and caves, about men who were scarcely men at all. The thoughts crowded in from nowhere, vague and formless, and that made them worse. They pressed on my mind without shape or logic, leaving only dread behind. And then, without warning, a drumbeat shattered the silence. The sound struck the air hard and sudden, deep, repetitive. Impossible. A drum had no place in those mountains. Hearing it there was like hearing a church bell ring from the depths of the sea. For a moment I stood frozen, my heart racing, convinced my senses had betrayed me. But before I could recover, something even stranger followed. A harsh, rattling noise, metal clashing against metal, burst through the fog, like a fistful of heavy keys shaken in fury. At the exact same instant, a dark-skinned, half-naked man tore past me, screaming as he ran. He came so close I felt the heat of his breath brush my face. In his hand he clutched an object made of interlocked steel rings, which he shook violently as he fled. He vanished into the mist as suddenly as he had appeared. And then I heard it. Heavy breathing, desperate, animal. A massive shape lunged after him, low, powerful, unmistakable. Its eyes burned, its jaws hung open, and its gait was that of a predator built for tearing flesh. I did not hesitate in naming it. It was a hyena. Strangely enough, the sight calmed me. The terror loosened its grip, replaced by a sudden certainty. This must be a dream. Nothing else made sense. Hyenas did not roam the hills of Virginia. Drums did not echo through forgotten ravines. Men did not materialize from mist like specters. Relieved by this conclusion, I tried to wake myself. I stepped forward boldly. I rubbed my eyes hard. I shouted into the fog, listening for my own voice. I pinched my arms, my legs, anything to break the illusion and return me to the solid world. But the mountains did not dissolve, and the dream did not end.
Eventually, I stumbled upon a small spring of water, clear and quiet amid the fog. I bent down, letting the cool liquid wash over my hands, my face,
my neck. The simple act seemed to dissolve the lingering unease that had clung to me. I straightened, inhaled deeply, and for a fleeting moment felt renewed, as if the world and I were newly aligned. Steady now, I pressed forward, confident in my steps, into the unknown. Hours passed, though time itself had lost meaning. Fatigue and the oppressive heaviness of the air finally forced me to pause. I sank beneath the shelter of a tree, seeking respite. Then, through the lingering mist, a weak slant of sunlight broke through. Shadows of the leaves traced delicate patterns on the grass before me, and I stared at them in disbelief. There was something impossible about the shadows, something that rooted my gaze. I looked up, and the truth struck me like a thunderclap. The tree above me was a palm. I looked up, and the truth struck me like a thunderclap. The tree above me was a palm. Panic replaced wonder. My previous conviction that I might be dreaming shattered entirely. This was no figment. My senses, sharp and commanding, insisted on reality. Every fiber of my being registered it. The air burned with heat that pressed down on me with oppressive weight. A strange, alien scent filled the breeze, sweet yet pungent, carrying hints of spices and distant lands. From somewhere far below, a low, continuous murmur reached my ears, soft yet alive. It was the sound of a river, vast and flowing, but interwoven with a strange chorus of human voices, countless and intricate, as though the plain itself were speaking. Before I could even adjust to the magnitude of this revelation, a sudden gust of wind tore through the fog, as if some unseen hand had lifted a veil. And then I saw it. Beneath me stretched the foot of a high mountain, and before my eyes unfurled a plain of unimaginable breadth. A majestic river wound through it like a silver ribbon, catching the sunlight in dazzling flashes. Along its banks stood a city that seemed to belong to another world. Eastern in appearance, yet unlike anything I had ever imagined. Even the Arabian tales of distant lands fell short. The buildings were strange, magnificent, and alive with light and motion, as though the city itself breathed. In that instant, the boundaries between reality and vision blurred completely. I realized I was no longer in the mountains of Virginia. I had crossed some invisible threshold, and the world that greeted me was as beautiful as it was terrifying. From my vantage point high above the city, I could see it in its entirety, as if the streets, the alleys, and the labyrinthine corners had all been etched onto a vast map. The thoroughfares were endless, twisting and winding in every direction. They were less streets than serpentine passages, bustling with life at every turn. The buildings themselves were nothing short of extraordinary. Balconies jutted at odd angles, verandas overhung the alleys, minarets rose like spires into the sun, and shrines and intricately carved oriels decorated every wall. Everywhere I looked, bazaars overflowed with a dizzying variety of goods, shimmering silks, delicate muslins, glinting cutlery, and jewels that blazed like captured fire. But it was not only merchandise that filled the streets. Flags fluttered in the wind, palanquins carried elegantly veiled ladies, elephants draped in gleaming fabrics and bells lumbered through the crowds. Idols, grotesque and magnificent, rose from the streets like ancient sentinels. Drums, gongs, and the clang of silver and gilded maces created a constant hypnotic cacophony. Amid the throngs of black and yellow men, robes flowing and turbans perched high, strange and sacred animals moved freely. Holy bulls ambled without concern, their presence commanding attention. Filthy, chattering apes swung from cornices, leapt from minaret to minaret, or clung to the carved oriels, filling the city with shrieks and echoing laughter. From the packed streets, broad flights of steps descended to the riverbanks, guiding the masses to the water. There the river struggled to thread its way through a fleet of heavily laden vessels, each jostling for passage through the crowded expanse. Beyond the city limits, the landscape transformed once more. Palms and cocoa trees rose in majestic clusters. Other towering ancient trees, strange in form, almost alien, stretched their limbs skyward. Scattered through these groves were rice paddies, thatched peasant huts, isolated temples, wandering gypsy camps, and solitary figures moving gracefully along the paths. One could spot a maiden with a water pitcher balanced on her head, moving with quiet purpose toward the river's edge. It was a world at once vibrant and alien, a place of chaotic beauty where the ordinary and the extraordinary merged so seamlessly that every glance seemed to reveal something new, something impossible. "You may think, of course, that I dreamed," Bedloe said, his voice low and intense, "but I did not. Everything I saw, everything I heard, everything I felt and thought had none of the hallmarks of a dream. It was consistent, coherent, unbroken. At first, I doubted whether I was truly awake, and so I tested myself again and again. Each test convinced me that I was. When one dreams and suspects that it is a dream, the suspicion alone usually wakes the sleeper immediately. Novalis said that we are near waking when we dream that we dream, and he was right. But my experience was different. I suspected, I questioned, I examined, and yet I remained fully, undeniably conscious. By every measure, this vision was real." Dr. Templeton nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps you are not wrong," he said. "Now, continue. You rose and descended into the city?" "I did," Bedloe replied, his eyes wide with astonishment. "I rose, as you say, and made my way down into the heart of the city. Almost immediately I was swept into an immense crowd, a living river of people flowing through every street and alley. The energy around me was wild, frenetic, a chaos of gestures and cries. And then, strangely, inexplicably, I felt it. A sudden burning sense that I belonged to the scene, that I was meant to act, though I could not yet understand how. Something about the movement of the crowd, the clamor of the streets, filled me with purpose, as if my very presence was required for some unseen event to unfold. Yet at the same time I recoiled. Among these thousands I sensed a deep instinctive animosity. Their faces, their motions, their very proximity pressed against me, and I shrank from them instinctively. I slipped away from the mass, moving through narrow, winding passages, taking a circuitous route to the city proper. And when I entered, what I encountered surpassed all expectation. The city itself seemed alive, thrumming with a furious energy. Every alley, every square was filled with tumult, voices shouting, animals screaming, banners waving, drums beating. Chaos reigned utterly. Yet beneath the disorder there seemed a strange purpose, a rhythm I could not yet name. I stood at the threshold, trembling, aware that I had been drawn here for reasons I could neither foresee nor resist.
A small band of men caught my attention, half clad in Indian garb, half in European dress, and led by officers wearing uniforms that seemed partly British. They were locked in fierce struggle with the throngs spilling through the alleys, vastly outnumbered, their desperate courage evident in every movement. Instinct drove me to join them. I seized the weapons of a fallen officer and plunged into the fray, striking blindly, driven by a raw, desperate ferocity. I did not know whom I fought, nor did it matter. The chaos demanded only action, and I obeyed. But numbers soon prevailed. Overwhelmed, we were forced to retreat, finding temporary refuge in a small kiosk. There we barricaded ourselves, panting and bloodied, for the moment safe from the unending tide outside. From a narrow loophole near the top, I peered out. A vast crowd pressed around a gaudy palace that overhung the river, its gates under furious assault. And then my eyes caught a strange, almost comical sight. From an upper window, a pale, effeminate figure descended, sliding along a cord fashioned from the turbans of his attendants.
A boat waited below, and with a delicate elegance he floated across the river to safety. It was at that moment a fierce resolve gripped me. I turned to my companions, issuing a few hurried, commanding words, enough to rally some to my purpose. Then, with reckless energy, we burst from our hiding place. We charged into the surrounding crowd. For a brief instant they recoiled before our fury, but the victory was fleeting. The masses regrouped, swarming again, and we were swept far from the kiosk, dragged into a labyrinth of narrow streets where sunlight never touched the ground. The passageways were suffocating, the walls of the overhanging houses leaning so close it seemed we could touch the sky with a finger. Arrows rained upon us, and the crowd pressed relentlessly, their spears jabbing with unerring precision. The projectiles twisted through the air like serpents, writhing in flight, resembling the exotic, fearsome crease of the Malay I have once read of in distant tales. Every step, every breath was a battle. Every heartbeat thudded with the fear that one false move would mean annihilation. And yet, amid the terror, a strange exhilaration surged within me, a feeling that I was alive in a way I had never known, part of something vast, overwhelming, and almost beyond comprehension. "They were shaped like living things," he said quietly, "long, black, curved to resemble a crawling serpent. Each carried a poisoned barb at its tip. One of them struck me here." He raised a trembling hand toward his right temple. The impact spun the world sideways. I staggered. I fell. What followed was immediate and unbearable. A wave of sickness tore through me, violent, absolute. I tried to breathe. I tried to move. I tried to resist it. I failed. I died. I smiled almost reflexively. "Surely now," I said lightly, "you won't insist that this was anything but a dream. You're not about to claim that you actually died." I expected laughter, or anger, or at least a clever retort. Instead, Bedloe faltered. His body stiffened. His face drained of color until it looked nearly translucent. His lips parted, but no sound came. He trembled, visibly, and said nothing. Unease crept into the room. I turned toward Dr. Templeton. He sat bolt upright, frozen in his chair. His teeth chattered softly against one another, and his eyes, wide, unblinking, seemed on the verge of tearing themselves free. At last, in a voice stripped raw, he spoke. "Go on," he said. "Proceed." Bedloe swallowed. "For a long time," he continued, "I felt only absence, darkness, not pain, nothing so defined, but a vast, empty awareness of being gone, of having ended. That knowledge alone remained. Then, without warning, something struck through me, a sudden, violent jolt like an electric current passing through the soul itself. With it came a strange sensation, not sight, but light, a feeling of expansion, of weightlessness. In the same instant, I rose." He paused, breathing shallowly. "But not as a body. I had no form, no voice, no limbs. I could not see, hear, or touch, yet I was conscious, fully aware. Beneath me the city had fallen silent, the crowd was gone, the uproar had collapsed into stillness. Below, on the ground, lay my body." His voice dropped to a whisper. "The arrow still stood in my temple. My head was grotesquely swollen, distorted beyond recognition, and yet I felt no horror, no attachment. That ruined thing meant nothing to me. It was irrelevant, like a garment already discarded." He shook his head slowly. "I had no will, no intention, and yet I moved, not walking, drifting. I was carried, buoyant and effortless, out of the city, retracing the same winding path by which I had entered it, as if drawn backward by a force I could neither resist nor understand. When I reached the point in the ravine where I had first seen the hyena, Bedloe said, it happened again. A sudden shock tore through me, violent, electric, like the discharge of a galvanic battery. In that instant, weight returned, substance returned, will returned. I was myself again. I stood once more in the mountains of Virginia, solid and breathing, and without hesitation I turned and made my way home. Yet whatever I had left behind had not faded. It retained the sharpness, the clarity, the authority of lived experience. Even now, not for a single moment can I force my mind to accept it as a dream. "It was not a dream," said Dr. Templeton. The words fell heavily into the room. "And yet," he continued, his voice low and solemn, "it would be difficult to name it anything else. Let us assume only this, that the human soul now stands at the threshold of discoveries vast enough to overturn everything we believe about consciousness itself. Let us be content with that for the present." He paused, then rose slowly. "There is something I must show you. I should have done so long ago. I did not because I could not. An unaccountable dread prevented me." From a case nearby he withdrew a small watercolor painting. We examined it closely. At first glance there was nothing remarkable about it, no strange symbolism, no supernatural distortion, and yet the effect it had on Bedloe was immediate and devastating.
He turned ashen. His knees buckled. He swayed, gripping the edge of the table as if to keep from collapsing. His eyes locked onto the image, wide with horror. It was only a miniature portrait, exquisitely detailed, almost impossibly precise. It was, so I believed at first, a likeness of Bedloe himself, every peculiar feature reproduced with astonishing fidelity. The same elongated frame, the same sunken pallor, the same unforgettable eyes. Templeton spoke softly. "You'll notice the date," he said, pointing to a faint inscription in the corner. 1780. He let the number hang in the air. "This portrait was painted in that year. It depicts a dear friend of mine, a man named Mr. Oldeb. We met in Calcutta during the administration of Warren Hastings. I was barely 20 years old at the time." Bedloe could barely breathe. "When I first encountered you, Mr. Bedloe," Templeton said, "at Saratoga, it was this resemblance, this impossible resemblance, that compelled me to speak to you. It was why I sought your acquaintance, why I cultivated your trust, and why I arranged matters so that I might remain constantly at your side." He lowered the painting. "I did not follow you out of charity," he said, "nor curiosity alone." He looked directly at Bedloe. "I followed you because in you I saw a man who had already lived." "In pursuing this matter," Templeton said, his voice measured, "I was guided partly by a deep, sorrowful memory of the deceased, but also, confess it, Bedloe, by a curiosity regarding yourself, uneasy and not without its own horror." He leaned forward. "The vision you described in the Ragged Mountains, the city, the streets, the crowd, the riot, was no invention of your mind. It was the Indian city of Benares, upon the Holy River, reconstructed with astonishing fidelity in your perception. The battles, the chaos, the massacre, they were real events recorded in the insurrection of Chait Singh in 1780, when Warren Hastings himself faced mortal danger. The man escaping along the string of turbans, that was Chait Singh. The group in the kiosk, sepoys and British officers trying to hold the streets, that was Hastings' party. And the officer who fell in the alleys, struck by the poisoned arrow of a Bengali, that officer was my dearest friend,
Oldeb. He produced a notebook, its pages marked with freshly inscribed script. "These manuscripts," he said, "demonstrate that while you wandered the hills perceiving these events, I was here at home detailing them exactly as they occurred, on paper, in real time." Bedloe's face drained of all color. The full weight of what he had experienced, the hallucination, the vision, the almost supernatural journey pressed down upon him. He realized, with a shiver that shook him to the core, that he had lived the memory of another man.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.